I won't talk any more about myself because you can investigate and Google that more if you like. Other than to say that on a personal note, I sometimes see the world slightly differently than some of my colleagues. And there is an explanation for that in part. And it may be that I have some people in the room that have the same issue. I'm assuming that what you're looking at, and hopefully you have reasonable graphics in front of you, is you can see a number in the, and you might want to just, someone in the chat box, if you're looking online, let us know what number you see. I see someone saying 3, so I might just move on to the next slide. Yes, you're quite right. It might be a bit small there, so I'll read out the text at the bottom. Those with normal colour vision will see a 3. Those who have red-green colour blindness will see a 5. So I'd be interested to know if there are any 5s. In actual fact, in that particular slide, I can't see anything. On this last line, it would suggest that I have total colour blindness. That's not quite the case. But the reason I wanted to share this with you is one of the things about doing educational research is the theory dependence of our observations. And what we all see is not necessarily the same thing. In my case, I don't see what the vast majority of you will see. In fact, it's quite rare, very rare for women to be colourblind who carry the dominant gene. Just so happened my mother was colourblind. Anyway, I won't linger on that, but just to give you a sense that I sometimes have a slightly different view of the world. What I want to do in the brief period we've got is just really explore 3 different projects that I've been involved in, and I've described these in the little blurb if you happen to see that, which I quickly pulled together, as 3 different layers of educational research, and I've chosen them deliberately because they kind of reflect research at the meta level, a study that could be described more in the meso level, and then a more of a micro level study. And I think all of those sorts of levels are interdependent and contribute to the overall picture or the story that we need to tell around distance, flexible online learning, whatever term we use. So I'm going to look at all of those, just following on my point about, and perhaps building on the metaphor of light. I kind of live a lot of my academic life and even my administrative life around this saying that the light comes through the cracks. And I think too often in education, we are about covering cracks rather than exposing cracks. For me, that's where the interesting part is. And that's also a bit of a philosophy about educational research, is look for what the real problems are. That's what we should be researching, and most definitely not trying to cover those cracks. So anyway, let me push on because I know time is tight and I've got a lot to cover. I want to talk about a study that I'm involved in, which I will describe around the value of higher education. This study is particularly relevant in New Zealand, but I think it has wider significance in the Western world. The clip that you can see there, and I don't expect you to worry about the detail, came from a newspaper in New Zealand about 18 months ago, where government policy was placing funding for older students, older learners, at some threat. In this case, some of the policies are really preventing students who are part-time, who might want to follow more flexible pathways. And more recently, after that particular debate from where the newspaper clipping comes from, the government has now made a decision that student loans, interest-free student loans, are no longer available to anyone over the age of 40. Quite interesting discrimination, all justified on the basis that the investment from the state in public education needs to provide a return. So if you're over 40, the return on that investment might not be seen as particularly strong or sufficient to justify the investment in the first place from a public point of view. So perhaps this cartoon also, or caricature here, picks up on some of the challenges we face. I'm sure the same situation arises in Canada, that the cost of higher education is increasing and increasingly being passed on from the public to the private or to the individual. And so this makes the value of higher education increasingly more important for us to understand, both privately and publicly. Following on this sort of line and just contextualising very briefly this study, in New Zealand, I'm sure there will be a similar move in Canada if it's not already existing on the provincial level. I'm thinking more at the federal, national level, to provide league tables, particularly around student completions and retention. One of the big concerns related to any form of flexible delivery, online, blended, I'll use all those terms a little bit interchangeably because they kind of mean different things to different people. But what we know is that completion rates, or some people might call them retention or attrition, are quite serious issues, and generally they are not as good as they would be for campus-based delivery. The slide here, again, I'm not asking you to look at the detail particularly, but Massey University and the national league tables around completion rates and retention appeared pretty much at the bottom of the table because that institution was made up of half of the students, about 17,000 distance students, and the rest were campus-based. And these league tables made no accommodation of the fact that the students were studying through a different modality or mode, and were also quite fundamentally different in their demographic. Again, from a perspective of the return on public investment, retained in study around 67% is not seen as good enough from the National Treasury perspective. So the guiding question really for this piece of work that I'm involved in is really looking at the wider social, cultural, but you'll see I've enlarged economic benefits of distance education to the nation. We kind of have a pretty good understanding of, through narrative, of what the benefits are to individuals and how empowering, enabling, and the opportunities to enhance life chances for individuals, and those stories are quite well documented in the literature. What isn't well documented is the benefits at a national level for the public good of more flexible forms of delivery. There are a number of studies, in fact there's a wealth of literature. These studies here come from New Zealand on the social and economic benefits of education, particularly with a focus on younger people in New Zealand, because that's been really the government policy, partly linked to ensuring that there were fewer unemployed in that younger demographic. Moving on elsewhere, there are studies here, or this particular study, I'll just quote, comes from New Zealand, which shows that the investment in higher education counts, at least in terms of how we count our unemployed. So very quickly, the top line shows those people with the top line of the graph or figure there, those with higher qualifications. So whilst there's a pattern in terms of perhaps trended with the nature of the economy, the state of the economy, people with higher qualifications are far less likely to be unemployed. As an aside, that also means they're far more likely to be paying taxes and not a drain on the state. So that's a taste of some of the benefits. But these data do not drill down to delivery mode. They don't make any distinction between the way in which a person has studied or is studying. Here's a well-known piece of work in the US, Education Pays. This study was last done in 2010, or last published in 2010. I think it's done on a 5-yearly basis, so you may want to drill into the extensive website with some of the stats that I'll just touch on. Linked to that in the US, and I'm not sure how clear the graphic is here, but there's been quite a bit of work in California where you may be aware education is a little bit of a basket case and very challenging to fund, but the calculations for California for higher education is that for every $1 that the state, or in this case yes, the California state invests, it receives about $4.50 back in return. This is something that's not always well understood by our politicians and perhaps even in the public domain. And then at the meta level, every year the OECD publish what they call Education at a Glance. It's a very, very comprehensive analysis of education, both at the K-12 level right through to higher education, and it's well worth being aware of when this comes out. Education at a Glance produces all sorts of statistics. Some of these, of course, are such at high level, you sometimes wonder the validity of those, because it's very difficult to compare country with country. The way in which the data is collected may not be the same. Definitions are not always the same. What I've got here, I'm not sure how clear this is coming through to you, but I just quickly circled Canada to show that the blue line in the bar shows the growth of your GPD for the particular year. I think this is year 2000 to 2010, so for that period. And the next line, the fainter line, is the tertiary investment. That's how it's defined. That would be post-secondary or university level, which is more than half of your growth in GPD is attributed to effectively higher education. So there's a very concrete evidence of the return on public investment and private investment given the cost of fees. Again, though, there is no data available about the opportunities that are available for people to study through online flexible ways. So we don't know what those benefits are for the public as distinct from a campus-based experience. So the particular study I'm involved in, and I'm sure you've heard the latest catchphrase of big data, in New Zealand as a small country, there is some very interesting big data being collected that is making it possible to connect up some of the databases that will allow us to answer that question about what are the benefits for people who are studying, perhaps in this case defined by distance. So those data combined with the narratives that we have has the potential to significantly change government policy and hopefully widen educational access. It may well challenge, I suspect, this view that somehow investing in older people is a poor return on public investment, because what we've found already from the data we have available is the completion rates for older students for distance delivery are actually much better than those who are under 25. So I think I'll stop at that note and just quickly have a look at the chat forum here to see if there are any questions, or at this point pose any questions. Either I don't know whether we're taking them orally or whether you just want to write them, and I'll pause for a moment to collect my thoughts before I move on to the next section. I see Roland has talked about the importance of, yes, the benefits of higher education, particularly with the costs. Obviously in an area like teacher education as a professional program, and I have a lot of experience of that being delivered entirely online for people in provincial or regional areas, generally there's a very high completion rate. It's the nature of a professional program. So Roland's just put there the benefits of e-learning, the greater benefits. So I think that's one of the challenges that I would, I guess, throw back and say that in the literature, there is actually only one study that's been published in the last 20 years that has produced some data linking to the national benefits. That was a small study in Hong Kong, where in their annual census, when they collect data about completion of higher qualifications, their census actually asks how that qualification was obtained. Was it obtained by distance? Again, you could put /online or from a campus experience. Collecting that then means you can drill down and look at other things. So the data that we're getting access to is linked to the New Zealand census, but a lot of other information too, including what we call our Inland Revenue Department. So we're being able to get aggregated data that's showing how much people are earning. Very, very sensitive using that kind of information, and it has got a number of rules wrapped around it. I think in light of time, what I'll do is push on, and we may have a little bit of time at the end, all going to plan, but no, can't guarantee that. So the second study I want to talk about, I described this more at a meso level, because clearly what I was talking about before was very much at sector-wide level, or what I call the meta level. This study has looked at, or is currently a work in progress, looking at the institutional deployment of a massive open online course initiative, a MOOC initiative. Whilst I was at Massey University in the last 6 to 9 months there, I was leading the implementation of Massey's venture with Open to Study, and I suspect that many of you have not heard of Open to Study. You've obviously probably heard of Coursera and edX and all perhaps the other platforms, including FutureLearn, which is the one based here in the UK. Open to Study is an Australasian initiative, and Massey University was the first university in New Zealand to launch into a MOOC initiative at an enterprise-wide level, in other words, full institutional support for. And you can look at the URL in your own time there, opentostudy.com. In Open to Study, they have currently, I think, around about 50 online subjects available, and arguably the model that's being used is slightly more, well, it's a different model from the Coursera model. It's done over a month. All courses are done within a month, and interestingly, the completion rates so far are closer to 30%, in fact sometimes above 30%, and completion rates of those who register and start the courses are actually over 60%. But putting that aside, more specifically what we were interested in were the 3 MOOC initiatives, or 3 MOOCs that were developed at Massey. I mean, I've just put some stats here which all of the MOOCs like to share to show how much impact they've had. In the Massey case, we were very focused on avoiding what I call the other acronym FOMO, the fear of missing out. So we put quite a lot of work into why we would want to embark on a MOOC venture, and not just simply be there because everyone else was in that space. And so there were 6 quite high-level strategic reasons why the university chose to embark on this particular venture. We launched 3 initial courses, one in the area of sustainable agriculture, which is the one you're looking at the moment, on international rankings, the QS ranking, which many of us regard as perhaps the better of the ranking systems. Massey University is 21st in the world in the area of agriculture. It's part of very important part of the New Zealand economy. Another area that we chose was emergency management. We had Massey had particular expertise there, and the developing world in particular, given a number of disasters, natural disasters in recent times, tsunamis and earthquakes and the like, there's a huge demand for emergency management. It might be called disaster recovery or something else in your part of the world. So it's a very immature field in the developing world, and that was where we were targeting. And we already offered at Massey a fully online master's degree in that particular area. And then lastly, hopefully something that should be dear to your hearts in Canada, the other online subject we chose was very strategic and very important for us, and that was Indigenous Studies. And that was a joint venture with the University of Tasmania in Australia, where we looked at Aboriginal peoples, that term is the term that's used in Australia, and then the New Zealand Māori. And so that particular online subject has actually only just been launched, and I think the next version of it's being offered on the 17th if anyone has a particular interest. As I say, that's more was done for philosophical reasons than anything else. So all of those courses have now been offered in one iteration, and the guiding question, I guess, for the team that I'm involved in, still continuing to, even though I've left the institution, is really around the benefits that have arisen for Massey University's participation. The reason I've just put those guiding questions is I think one of the lessons here is really important what questions you ask. In this case, we really think that the question actually goes well beyond the Massey University setting, and that's why I'm continuing to be involved. Clearly, MOOCs are a work in progress, and no one can predict how they might evolve. Just looking at the time, I think I'm going to slip through the questions, and obviously, as I think I framed this whole session, in many respects, I'm just posing and leaving threads there for what I hope will be conversations, perhaps after I'm even closed off. So the last study I want to talk about more at the micro level is a study that is now completed, the previous one a work in progress. This one wanted to really find some of the insights that we can learn from distance learners or online learners, particularly in their own words. In fact, the title of the study included in their own words, because framed around this complex issue of attrition or retention through to completion, There's a huge amount of literature around completion and retention for campus-based learners and an emerging amount of literature in terms of online learners. There's an interesting distinction made in the literature between soft and hard factors, and many of the challenges that learners face are soft factors that institutions don't necessarily have too much control over. The particular gap in the literature that this study tried to look at, first and foremost, there's a lot of literature that focuses in on the first year experience where we know some of the risks are greatest, but there was virtually nothing that focused on the first year experience of online/distance learners, and in particular, drilling down even further, there was a dearth of literature presenting their experience from the student or the learner's voice. A lot of the research suffers from a flaw of being somewhat institutionally centric. So this particular study really was framed to improve the supports and services available to first-time distance learners that wanted to make an impact, if you like, and in particular drilled down to what the experiences were of being a first-time distance learner from a student perspective. The methodology was framed around design-based research using a mixed method approach with a number of phases, which I'll skip through fairly quickly, ultimately with quite a strong phenomenological dimension. In actual fact, really the heart of the study was the third phase, in which we used video diaries and supplied the students with Sony Bloggy cameras with USB ports to plug in, and ultimately through those diaries capturing their experience, we had over 22 hours of video footage over the course of one semester. The sample was not huge. I'm not sure if I've got a slide. I don't have a slide. In the end, for quite pragmatic reasons or feasibility reasons, we could only accommodate 20 students, although we did try to capture the diversity that makes up the student population of first-time distance learners. I've just given you one slide here with one of the students, this one in the 30 to 39 age bracket, a Māori woman. Māori students would be seen at high risk for various reasons, and this particular woman had 7 children and also had a mother that was terminally ill with cancer that she was looking after. So you can understand that she certainly was in a high risk category, and in addition to that she was studying full time. I can't play you the videos, which I would like to. I don't really have the time, but very briefly, and the report I've got there, you can see the URL. If I get a moment, I can post it in the chat box so you can directly link to it. But dhub.edu.au, and then you can find from there on. Certainly these video diaries gave us a really interesting insight into the soft factors I referred to. More particularly though, and there are lots of other findings, I've just pulled out 3, they helped us show how some of the rhetoric around how flexible online distance forms of learning don't quite match with the realities of what the experience is really like. So many of the students thought that this kind of study was going to allow them to fit the study around their life commitments or other life commitments, when in actual fact the demands were quite different from that and were not as flexible as they understood. One of the implications being we need to sell that message a little bit more clearly out at the front end so that we can ensure student success. They're not coming in with misrepresentations. And then also the other thing that particularly came through was that in the literature around supporting students, the first few weeks are seen as absolutely critical, whereas in actual fact this study showed not just the first few weeks, but about 3/4 of the way through the semester or the term, depending on your language, there was another absolutely crucial at-risk period. And in the case of Mass University, we tended to have numerous supports in the first few weeks, but not much as the semester continued. So that's something that, as an outcome of the study, we've changed. And in actual fact, one of the outcomes or the impact of the study is the development of a very clear life student success strategy that matches the study of thinking about study, making the first few weeks progressing through to completion, with each of these cells you see with interventions that are appropriate for all students. Some are targeted at certain students, some are at-risk students, and some are for failing students, to avoid the kind of goulash approach of throwing interventions at all students without necessarily understanding whether they are meeting their needs at the point of need. So coming to conclusion, noting the time, really I guess this is a bit tongue-in-cheek. A conclusion is a place where you get tired of thinking. I'm getting a little dry in my throat at the moment. Probably what I want to leave you with is, in framing educational research, I often talk about how the question is the answer. And I like to think of research as telling a story, and it's really important you have a sense of your voice and who it is that's telling that story. So these questions for me are questions that I often ask myself when framing a study and reading other people's research. Who's telling the story? What's the story they are telling, and from which perspective? Because there will be multiple perspectives. Most importantly, what story isn't being told? That's a good example of the last study I've been telling you about, where the story of the student in their own words is very rarely told. And then what's missing from the story so far? And the study I've talked about in terms of higher education and its value, the story that's missing is the value of what really more alternative, flexible forms of study might have for both private benefits and public benefits. So on that note, I think I should stop. Whether I've left time for questions now, I'm unsure. I'll take feedback and we'll see where we go from there. Thank you. These slides are also on SlideShare on my SlideShare site, which is mbrown with a Z on it, or a Z, depending upon how you say it. So mbrown for NZ at the end is for New Zealand. Wouldn't be too hard to do a Google search. I uploaded them about half an hour before the presentation. Just a little apologetic that I haven't really left a lot of time for interaction, which is one of the features of this technology where we really want to have a conversation, but I'm hoping I've planted some seeds for conversations that will continue. Just looking at the question, I'm assuming we've got a couple of minutes. No one feel free to cut me off midstream. I think one of the challenges, particularly when we start talking about meta-level data, what do we mean by the different terminology? In New Zealand, we were fortunate that every institution had to report on the modules or units that are offered and whether they fall into a category of being only face-to-face or blended or fully online. Obviously, there are definitions like Sloan Academies, the Sloan Corporation's consortium, definitions of blended learning. To my mind, I don't think we've got any sense of consensus with the terminology, and that makes it quite problematic then when you make international comparisons.
Thank you so very much for this, Mark. I'm just going to wait for a couple more minutes for any additional questions that come through. I don't know if you have fully responded to that question that's actually sitting there. So that definition of online learning, it's one that's of great import or interest to me from the perspective that there doesn't seem to be a lot of differentiation of asynchronous versus synchronous, and therefore what are the affordances for engagement, for motivation that accrue from the various kinds of affordances that are available. And I think that makes a huge difference. In fact, it's one that we're sort of staking our reputation on, suggesting that synchronous is going to give you a lot more advantages in some ways, particularly but when also paired with asynchronous. So we're not getting rid of the asynchronous, but we are ensuring that synchronous has a very, very prominent place in terms of what we're doing online. Can you comment on that?
Yes, I mean, certainly the terminology, as I've already said, is problematic. I often use a quote that all generalizations are dangerous, including this one. Um, and when we read about online learning or whatever the terms that people use, e-learning, we have to really take those comments and observations with a great deal of caution, because e-learning, online learning covers things from multi-choice tests online, following a very instructionalist view of the world, to very engaging and deep forms of authentic learning using synchronous and asynchronous technologies. So it's the problem again for people like me who are interested in drilling down and looking at some of the impacts of the different methodologies. So when we're talking about online learning, if we don't know how it's framed, what philosophy underpins it, then we're comparing oranges with apples or lemons, and it's not a fair comparison. I think the thing that I would say, and I'm sure we're talking the same language, is the key thing about learning design is understanding who your audience are, who your students are, what your learning intentions or learning outcomes are, and then matching the appropriate technologies, including face-to-face if that's available to you, to achieve the ends that you're looking for. So one of the great things in recent times is previously synchronous technologies were quite problematic. The fact that you've been able to record even this presentation, this discussion, means that those who can't make it right now, which is not particularly flexible, I might add, for them, at least they can come and view that in their own time. So it's slightly more inclusive than some of the ways we had to use audio conferencing in the past. But absolutely, I think synchronous technologies, the mere fact that I hope a sense of presence is coming through because you can see me, clearly the literature in this area is very, very supportive of the importance of teacher presence. In fact, teacher presence can accommodate a lot of issues around the content not perhaps being quite at high value in terms of its production.
We'll have to have a further conversation about that one because we're moving in a slightly different direction. However, there is another question on from the floor that Todd has placed in there. So courses recently announced Nobel laureate as expert teachers for certain courses. What do you think of this development, and how can the expert learning be defined in a MOOC experience?
I guess strikes quite deeply at where I understand an expert is. And in education, even the word expert has connotations. I know in New Zealand, so it might be a term that culturally means different things as well from one country to another. My own doctorate actually looked at, drilled down to a distinction between proficient teachers, accomplished teachers, experienced teachers, because some of you may be familiar with some of the work of David Bernlein way back, I think probably 15, maybe a decade ago now. It all comes down to what we're defining expertise to be, and if we don't get the definition right, then we might well be reifying something that's not particularly valid. One thing we know is that expertise comes with experience, but experience alone does not contribute to expertise. The other thing is how you become expert is through a process of making mistakes. So trying to cover up that by showing someone who's expert, and let's just take that as unproblematic for a minute, might be counterproductive for someone who's a novice, because you really have to, it's a long process to acquire that expertise, and sometimes it's better to show things that are not accomplished and very polished, because that can be quite off-putting. I'm not quite sure whether I'm answering entirely the question, partly because I'm not familiar with that particular announcement.
Thanks for that. I think you moved in a direction that is of import to some of us. Many of us in the EI lab anyways are working on competency-related kinds of issues, and you went exactly in that kind of direction, so thank you for that. Todd, I don't know if that addresses what was going on in that on the floor. He's on another floor than I am, Mark, and that's why I don't quite know what the distinction is here.
Well,
any other questions?
If someone's interested in that area, I would encourage them to go back and read the work that was done with chess players. That's back in the 70s and early 80s, looking at what expertise is within chess. And that work has been very, very influential in our understanding of what constitutes expertise and how you acquire it.
Thank you. Just looking for any more questions. Is there anything coming from Twitter? No, I've got TweetDeck running on mine. Anyways, I don't see anything else coming at this point. Well, hold on. Todd is typing.
Well, just to pick up on the little thing that I see Todd's written there about competency expectations, I think the great challenge is when you go down a competency path is to avoid something that's particularly reductionist. And so I'm very quite taken with the literature around curriculum mapping and learning outcomes, constructive alignment, that recognizes that if you take that too far, you can lose the essence of the discipline or the essence of the profession. So there has kind of been a tendency in certain parts of the world that I'm familiar with to be overly reductionist and lose sight of the fact there are some qualities about a particular profession, the essence of that profession, that might not be captured when you drill down too tightly. And those holistic outcomes also need to be captured in any kind of competency-based framework.
You're absolutely right. I think because there are no more questions at this point in time, we're going to say thank you so very, very much. And I don't know if you're willing to do this, but if we have any additional questions that come by way of Twitter or come to us by way of email, would you be willing to actually take a look at those and perhaps respond to them, and we can post them at the EI Lab site or something along those lines?
Absolutely happy to do that. That wouldn't be a problem at all. And I've just sent a link to a couple of the reports and slides that I've mentioned if anyone wants to follow up on those.
Great. We've already posted those as well onto Twitter, so they're good to go. Thank you again so very much, Mark. You have outlined many of the issues that we're struggling with here as well, and I think given us lots of opportunity to engage in conversation, further conversation about them and the implications for our own work here at UOIT. So thank you again.
Thanks very much. A pleasure.
We'll talk to you soon. So that brings us to the conclusion of the morning. We will have an hour's break, and we will reconvene both on the second and third floor in 1 hour's time. Thank you. Have a good lunch.